I'd like to go through the instruments in the orchestra with you to help you prepare for one of the possible essay questions on the first test. Here is the list of families in the symphony orchestra. You would expect strings, woodwinds, brass, and percussion. As music appreciation students, what I'd like you to be able to do on the first test is to be able to, if you see an instrument, that you're able to put it into its family. For example, the violin is a string instrument. And ultimately, eventually, I'd like you guys to be able to recognize them not only by the way they look, but also by the way that they sound. So I'll also show you some resources that will help you with that. Here on page 55 is a typical distribution of orchestral instruments. I'm going to just skip past this because it really does depend on whose symphony you're listening to. For example, a Mozart symphony would be much smaller than what you see here, and you might even see a symphony that has more than what's listed here. So it really depends. To keep it simple, I made a list of the instruments that would fall under each category. The string family is made up of, going from high to low, violin, viola, cello, and double bass. You might think of some other string instruments like banjo or mandolin, and those definitely are string instruments, but those are string instruments that you really wouldn't see in an orchestra, not typically anyway. So these are the four, and they correspond roughly to the pitch range of voices: soprano, alto, tenor, bass. In a little bit, I'll show you where to go, where you can see videos of people playing these instruments. You can start to listen for their individual, what's called timbre or tone color. Next would be the woodwind family. This is kind of an odd group because the sounds, while they're all produced by blowing into the instrument, they all have different ways of producing the vibration that's required to make a sound. The flute is the highest. Actually, it has there's a little instrument called the piccolo that you'll sometimes see, but typically there would be the flute. They used to be made out of wood, and sometimes you'll still see wooden flutes, but in the orchestra, typically they're made out of metal. And then you have the oboe and the clarinet and the bassoon. The oboe and the clarinet look very similar, but when you look at them closely, you'll see that the mouthpiece is different. The oboe is a double reed instrument, where the clarinet is a single reed instrument whose piece of cane is attached to a mouthpiece. So they produce sound in a little different way. The bassoon, like the oboe, is a double reed instrument, and it's the lowest sounding woodwind in the woodwind family. Actually, there's a bigger instrument called the contrabassoon that you'll sometimes see that can play an octave lower than the regular bassoon. The brass family is made up of the trumpet, French horn, trombone, and tuba. You may think of some other brass instruments that maybe fall in between the pitch ranges of the instruments that are listed here. And you might sometimes see something like a cornet or a baritone in an orchestra, but typically these would be the four instruments that you would see. The last group is the percussion group, and this one really does vary. The most common on the list here, and this list is by no means complete, the most common is the timpani. And you'll see a picture of the timpani in your book on page 56. Also common is the bass drum, the cymbals, the triangle, the gongs, the marimba, sometimes the cowbell, the snare drum, anything that you can strike. Another instrument that you might consider falling into the percussion family, well, or even the string family, would be the piano. And that's something that sometimes you'll see inside of the orchestra, but really more often, if you're going to see a piano, it will be up front as a solo instrument in a concerto. And more about that in another lesson. Here on page 56, it shows you the layout of the symphony. Now, this really can vary, so I'm going to show you a website you might be interested in going to that explains this with a little more detail. This comes from a youth orchestra in the United Kingdom somewhere. Its web address is www.gcdyo.org.uk, and I like it because it explains some of the instruments, the common ones and the less common ones in the orchestra. There's the strings, there's the woodwinds, the brass, and the percussion. So check that out if you're interested. Okay, here we are in the shell. I want to show you this great resource that we have. Click on Elements of Music. And we scroll down here to Musical Timbre. Timbre means tone color. And here it introduces the voices and musical instrument families and individual instruments. So I'm going to click on Western Musical Instruments. And there are the families. And there, for each family, are these instruments. And you can click on them and hear what they sound like. For those of you that have played in band or orchestra, it may be not that difficult to identify the individual instruments, but for a lot of you, I suspect that you're not familiar with them yet. So my advice to you is just to go to lots of concerts. The best way to identify them is to be able to see them and hear them at the same time. We do have another fine resource, and there's a couple different ways to get to it, and let me show you. Okay, you guys, there's a piece that's just fabulous for help with identifying not only the families but the instruments. You can get to this piece a couple different ways. One way, as usual, is to go to the weekly module and click on that on the course resources and materials folder, and there'll be a link in there. But just in general, anytime you want to access the playlist, what you do is scroll down here to the playlist of music with links to listening guides. So when I click on that, this is what comes up, is this. You click on playlist, and the piece that you'll find this in the resource folder is the Benjamin Britten Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra. So I click on that. You have the opportunity to see this piece via video. Now I have to give you guys a heads up and tell you the video is really old, but and it's really grainy because it's old, but what's great about it is that it's narrated. So the conductor narrates and tells you what instruments are playing as they're playing. And another way to listen to it is to follow the listening guide.